Right now, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in the death of George Floyd, will be sentenced after a month-long jury trial. Joining us now is Fox 9 Minneapolis' Bill Keller. Bill, good morning. We know that Chauvin's legal team is pushing for probation, but what's the likely outcome?
That is not very likely. I mean, in Minnesota, you mentioned he's convicted of all three of these charges, but you don't do those concurrently. You don't add them all up, because otherwise he'd be looking at a lot of time. Instead, they take the most serious charge, which in this case is second-degree intentional murder. That carries a maximum 40-year sentence. They're probably not going to give him 40 years. In fact, state prosecutors are asking for 30 years. He's asking for probation. It will likely wind up somewhere in the middle. Believe it or not, the state guideline, based on his criminal history or lack of, is only 12 and a half years. But the judge is considering aggravating factors because, for example, this happened in front of a crowd, including young children.
Now, Derek Chauvin invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to testify during the actual trial. Can we expect him to make a statement during today's proceedings?
You know, it's unlikely. It'd be very surprising. We know, of course, the family of George Floyd will do that. They'll say something at the hearing. They'll provide a victim impact statement. But keep in mind, as you say, he did not testify at trial. And even if he wanted to make a statement, it's unlikely it would happen because it could impact his federal trial. He still faces another complete series of charges for violating George Floyd's civil rights. In fact, we spoke with legal experts that say he's kind of between a rock and a hard place. If he wants to go in there and say, I'm sorry, show remorse, say something to the Floyd family that might reduce his sentence, that could then be used against him in that civil case, that federal trial, and that would be looking at even more prison time in a federal prison.
Bill, right now we are showing a few shots from protests during the actual trial. This raises the question, are there any security measures in place during the sentencing?
It looks much different in downtown Minneapolis than it did a month ago. It was really an occupied space down there. You saw the razor wire and the chain link fences around so many of these buildings. Those have since all been removed, so downtown Minneapolis is pretty much back to normal this summer. They did decide to close the courthouse. That's also the center of Hennepin County's government center. That's closed for today while this hearing is going on. They will have extra police both at the building and security downtown. There are several marches and rallies that are planned regardless of how much Derek Chauvin is sentenced to. But in the past, those have mostly remained peaceful because they got the guilty verdict they wanted. Now, hopefully, they'll get the sentence they're looking for as well.
Now, as we mentioned before, we expect Chauvin's legal team to ask for probation. Now, if sentencing does not go this way, are there any options for Chauvin's attorneys?
Well, keep in mind, he's already asking for a complete other trial. He wants this one thrown out. There were a lot of curveballs that came at this. There was that third-degree murder conviction, the charge that was dropped and added, and not to mention the fact that there was so much publicity around this case. From the very beginning, his team has been saying he can't get a fair trial because of all the media coverage. Then you had the president. You also had, I should say, representatives in Congress making comments about this trial. They want to ask the judge to throw this out, that it somehow has prejudiced the jury. But of course, they were sequestered. They were told not to be watching any of this media coverage. And again, there's still that whole federal trial still to come up.
Bill, we have depended on you for coverage since day one. So I'd like to know, is there anything else that you're paying attention to today?
Yeah, we'll be keeping a really close eye on kind of the mood in the city. There's been several other incidents happening. There's been some unrest in a very popular young area of town. There was another individual that was shot and killed. This was not by police, but by a U.S. Marshals task force. I think we've talked about that in the last couple of weeks. We saw a little bit of unrest down there this morning. No real reason for that, but we'll, going into this weekend, it'll be very interesting to see the reaction.
All right, Fox 9 Minneapolis' Bill Keller. Always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.